All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started and let people filter in as they may. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Philip Rothrock, and I'm a program manager with Forest Trends, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. And Valentine's Day is just around the corner, and many folks will be going to the store to pick up some chocolates to show that they care. And unfortunately, there can be a darker side to chocolate. Next slide. So too many impoverished farmers are unfortunately relying on child labor and clearing forests, including those home to chimpanzees, in order to produce cocoa ingredients found in some of the chocolate products we buy. So in recognition of these risks, a number of influential cocoa traders and chocolate manufacturers and retailers have recently made public commitments to deforestation-free supply chains. Next slide. So today we are joined by experts from Rainforest Alliance, Nestle, and Forest Trends who will walk us through how companies are implementing these cocoa commitments and how these efforts align with best practice. First, I will provide a brief context for the webinar and our research. Next, I will pass it off to Leah, who will speak about best practice guidance for key implementation areas. Then over to Kate, who will present Forest Trends research findings on company uptake of best practices. And then finally, Daryl will share how Nestle's experience has been in implementing its commitments. This will be followed by, these 10-minute presentations will be followed by a question and answer session. So please, if you have questions, at the bottom of your screen, you can find a Q&A button where you can direct questions towards the panelists. And with that, next slide. So just a little bit of background. Next slide, please. And just for a little background, for the last 6 years, Forest Trends Supply Chain Initiative has drawn from publicly reported data to track over 900 companies for their commitment goals, procurement policies, and progress towards achieving deforestation-free supply chains. This is a response to a growing need for market transparency and accountability. So you can go to supply-change.org to find profiles of company commitments on cattle, soy, palm oil, and timber pulp and paper, which are the big kind of commodities associated with deforestation. But now today, thanks to support from Ceres and NORAD, we track cocoa commitments too. Next slide, please. So just as a little bit of background and context for the presentations, kind of looking at recent trends since the inception of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative back in 2017, there's been a surge of commitments to address cocoa-driven deforestation amongst 35 influential cocoa and chocolate companies that are members, as well as governments of some of the largest cocoa producing countries in the world, most notably Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, but then also Colombia and more recently Cameroon. And so as part of their participation agreements, these cocoa companies and producing countries have created action plans, including around farmer mapping, as well as smallholder farmer engagement. But despite a growing number of commitments from these companies and others, cocoa-driven deforestation and commodity-driven deforestation as a whole has continued, along with human rights issues such as child labor. So understanding key areas for improvement will increasingly be important as these companies are mandated to address these issues. If you've noticed in the news, there's recently been the emergence of legislation and regulation proposals in Europe the United Kingdom, and even in the US to limit commodities that may be associated with deforestation. So with that in mind, building on several years of partnership, Forest Trend Supply Chain Initiative and the Accountability Framework Initiative, or for short AFI, have teamed up to examine how some of the most influential cocoa companies have been implementing their commitments, and we're benchmarking their performance against best practice in a few key areas. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Leah Sandberg from the Rainforest Alliance, who also works with their Accountability Framework Initiative. And she'll go over in more detail the best practice guidance outlined in the Accountability Framework. So with that, next slide.
Great. Thank you, Philip, and thanks to your team for collaborating on this report and the invitation to speak on this webinar. I think it's a really sort of interesting set of facts we put together. So for reviews of corporate sustainability progress, such as this one, it's useful to be clear about the expectations for best practice that underlie it. And that's really where the accountability framework comes in. So I'm going to give just a short overview of the framework for those who might not be as familiar before turning it back over to the supply chain team to discuss the findings from their report. Next slide, please. So what is the Accountability Framework Initiative? The initiative is a collaborative effort to achieve ethical supply chains in agriculture and forestry. It is has a broad commodity scope applicable to all commodities posing risks for deforestation, conversion, and human rights violations, including cocoa. It has a broad geographic scope. It's designed to be globally applicable with the ability to be contextualized for different sectors, locations, contexts, etc. However, topically, the scope is actually fairly narrow. It provides guidance and best practice around deforestation and conversion of other natural ecosystems and respect for human rights. So there are certainly many aspects of cocoa sustainability, supply chain sustainability that are not included in the scope of the framework. So to be clear, when we're talking about our principles and best practices, this is the scope of that work. Next slide. So who is the initiative? Really, the strength of the Accountability Framework Initiative comes from our coalition, which is a large and constantly expanding coalition of social and environmental groups working together toward ethical supply chains in both producing and consuming markets, working across the various pathways that civil society groups work with companies, with investors, with governments, really very broad-reaching work to try to set consistent expectations for best practices across all of the different ways in which we work. Next slide, please. So in addition to working as a coalition, the Accountability Framework Initiative is working with many of the other key initiatives in the space to align their guidance and systems with each other and with the framework. So there are numerous initiatives, tools, systems in responsible investment, in certification, in site establishment and management implementation protocols, reporting, monitoring and assessment tools, industry policy and sectoral initiatives. We're working with all of these partners to better align their systems with the framework. And what this means is that companies can use the framework as an overall approach across their whole business, and consistent with this approach, they can use these context-specific tools in different parts of their business, from site planning to corporate sustainability reporting. It also means that companies can use the framework as detailed and practical guidance to carry out other commitments and obligations, such as those in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, the New York Declaration on Forests, etc. So the framework is really designed to both support and be supported by all of these existing initiatives. Next slide, please. So the accountability framework can be used by companies in a number of ways. The framework provides clear expectations and best practices for policy setting, implementation, and reporting on supply chains company-wide. It helps to define a process for managing risks and impacts of non-certified supply. It helps to improve consistency in how company performance is monitored, reported, and assessed in collaboration with a number of the organizations listed on the previous slide. And it's designed to really guide the integration of company efforts to address supply chain risk that include both environmental and human rights issues. Our steering group and coalition include environmental and human rights-based organizations that work across all commodities and all origins. And finally, the framework helps to align all of the multiple and increasing standards, guidelines, tools, and policies that govern production and trade of forest and conversion risk commodities. So it's really designed to be used across the scope of activities that companies are carrying out in efforts to achieve these ethical supply chains. Next slide, please. So what is in the framework? The basis of the framework is 12 core principles that cover all aspects of developing an ethical supply chain, including setting and strengthening commitments, implementing ethical supply chains, and then reporting progress. Those 12 principles are accompanied by detailed operational guidance and a set of consensus-based definitions that really help to provide consistency across the implementation of these principles. So the framework includes 3 principles on setting and strengthening commitments for protection of forests, for human rights, and protection of other ecosystems. It includes a set of principles around implementation of ethical supply chains, including supply chain management and supplier management, including on the ground implementation in land acquisition, land management, restoration, including broader collaboration for at the jurisdictional or sectoral level, and including monitoring and verification of all of those implementation steps. And then finally, it provides guidance on effective reporting, disclosure, and claims related to these topics. The layout of the framework, you can sort of check our website at accountabilityframework.org. We've got all of the information about both what's in these principles, how they're related to our guidance. We have brief topical summaries for many of the topics included here, and sort of other ways to really use and dive into a lot of these principles. Next slide, please. So the initial focus as the framework was conceived of, launched, first looked at was on setting and strengthening commitments, no deforestation commitments, no conversion commitments, commitments to respect for human rights, really focusing on the content and specification of these sustainability commitments. And this has led to an increase in robust goals and targets in a lot of these key commodities. Increasingly, as Philip has noted, there's been a focus on the cocoa sector. So we're starting to see a lot of that move towards robust goal setting, move into this sector. However, to some extent, this is sort of, this is sort of old news almost. I think people are increasingly getting a sense of what these sustainability commitments should entail. And we are excited to be really focusing on the next stage of this journey. Next slide, please. So really a lot of the meat of the framework are best practice for implementing ethical supply chains. And that's really what this report by Supply Change is about. It's attention on how companies are how commitments are implemented across company supply chains. So a supply chain team is going to dig into all of the details of their findings, but we are working really hard to set best practice for what does good traceability look like, what does good risk assessment look like, what does good supplier management look like, et cetera, and really trying to provide actionable practical guidance on all of these topics that can then be used by organizations such as Supply Change to set sort of a baseline for what best practice looks like as they continue to assess company performance. Next slide, please. And then finally, something we're not going to touch on that much today, but is really what makes all of the work that Supply Change does possible, which is reporting. So we have core principle 12 on reporting, disclosure, and claims. The framework provides guidance on what robust reporting looks like. And more importantly, we work really collaboratively to ensure that the framework can efficiently guide corporate reporting. So this is just a little bit of a snapshot of what you would find on our reporting page on our website. We provide an overview of using the framework to guide reporting, and then detailed guidance on what robust reporting on the topics within the scope of the framework look like. We collaborate closely with a lot of reporting platforms and standards, such as a CDP Forest, such as the Global Reporting Initiative, to try to ensure that companies using the framework are able to report effectively against these tools. And we also work closely with a number of companies such as supply chains that look at company assessment scorecard ratings, such as Forest 500 or ZSL Spot. So we really are working to ensure that our guidance on reporting aligns with the ways in which companies are being assessed and scored. Next slide, please. So the topic of the day is cocoa. The Accountability Framework Initiative is active across all major forest risk commodities, including cocoa, and our coalition works with many of the traders, downstream manufacturers, and buyers of cocoa in many ways to help benchmark their commitments, to work on implementation systems, to work on reporting related to cocoa. So we really work all the way across the supply chain. However, we're also increasingly working on the ground in producing regions to try to improve the utility of the framework to upstream producers and processors of cocoa. So I wanted to highlight a couple of the things that we are currently working on. So some ways in which the accountability framework is being used in the upstream part of the cocoa supply chain is that early drafts, just as at the sort of even before the time of publication of the framework, it was being used by the Cocoa and Forest Initiative in development of their frameworks for action for participating countries. And then some current activities. Currently in Ghana, we're working with ProForest to support a pilot group of cocoa companies to use the framework to identify gaps and priorities in their CFI commitment implementation. So figuring out how the framework can best be used as a tool to help these upstream companies implement their CFI commitments. And similarly in Cameroon, we're working with Cargill's subsidiary Telcar to align both their Rainforest Alliance certified and uncertified cocoa volumes with Cargill's overall deforestation-free commitment. So figuring out how those commitments can be really pushed upstream to those levels for both certified and uncertified cocoa supplies. And then finally, also in Cameroon, we're currently collaborating with IDH to align the Cameroon's national deforestation-free roadmap with the framework. So it's really trying to ensure that the sort of best practices ingrained in the framework get mapped onto all of these increasing initiatives in cocoa. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to touch on one more topic before handing it back, which is that certification obviously plays a large role in cocoa supply chains among others. Companies can use certification, such for example as Rainforest Alliance certification, to fulfill key elements of the accountability framework. So I want to talk a little bit about that relationship just to clarify, because that's something that I think is something we get a lot of questions about, and that's really interesting to folks, especially in the cocoa sector. So again, as with many certification systems, companies using the certification can use that to achieve the best practices of the framework. So for example, the farm requirements of the Rainforest Alliance 2020 Sustainable Agricultural Standard are aligned with the framework on no deforestation, no conversion, and respect for human rights. So for example, this includes the standard has a no conversion requirement with a cutoff date that aligns with the framework's guidance. It has assess and address mechanisms for human rights violations that align with the framework's guidance. It has requirements for long-term protection of natural ecosystem and conservation. And then finally, use of identity preserved and segregated supply chain options align with the framework's expectations around supply chain traceability and control. So this shows ways in which both certification can be used to achieve the goals of the framework, and then also ways in which the framework can be used as sort of a leveling platform to address both certified and non-certified supply chain volumes. And with that, I will hand it back over to supply chains, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you, Leah. I think that was a a good, interesting review of kind of what the accountability framework looks like and how that applies to implementation, and some kind of exciting applications there in terms of Cameroon and other places. Now we're going to pivot to our next speaker, Kate Ellis, who works with me at Forest Trends Supply Chain Initiative. She'll be presenting our new research findings on how well companies are implementing their commitments and how that aligns with best practice. She'll be highlighting some of the key findings that we've had in and will be presenting in our new report, which we will publish on our website, supply-change.org, and it'll be released on the website later today. And with that, I'll kick it off to Kate.
Thanks, Philip. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be speaking with you all today. As mentioned by my colleagues, Supply Change recently developed a report which will analyze how corporate commitments are really aligning with the accountability framework. And for this report, Supply Chain reviewed 69 of the world's largest chocolate companies operating across the supply chain, while really focusing on those in kind of sourcing from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So today, I'm going to highlight the key findings from our report in 4 areas, including corporate commitments, traceability, monitoring, and support for suppliers. Next slide, please. So to provide a little snapshot of the companies in our report, as you can see here, we found that almost 80% are based in North America and Europe. This is to be expected as both regions account for nearly 60% of global chocolate imports. We also found that as many as 70% of companies are operating downstream as manufacturers or retailers who are closer to the final sale and consumption of chocolate. And overall, the demand for chocolate is largely driven for its use in foods and beverage, various consumer goods. We found that 39% of companies disclose operating under food products in that related industry. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked a little bit about company operations, let's take a look at commitments. Commitments are considered any corporate statement that targets the procurement of certified commodities, supply chain traceability, and any other target of deforestation or environmental degradation. Moreover, commitments are a crucial driver of corporate action and accountability. In our report, we found 55% of companies have made at least one commitment to source sustainably produced cocoa, and 37% explicitly targeted no deforestation in some way. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of a breakdown of our commitment data. As you can see by this chart, we found that 31 companies do not have commitments. Out of the 38 that do have commitments, 26 explicitly targeted no deforestation in some way. It's really important to note that not all corporate commitments are made equal. The framework really emphasizes that commitments should cover a company's entire supply chain or have a clear rationale for any exclusions. In the report, we found that, in fact, many companies restricted their geographic scope, the timeline for attainment, or the cocoa products covered by their commitments. So despite having a commitment, many companies are actually lacking the key areas of depth and transparency in alignment with the framework. Next slide, please. So next, let's touch on traceability. Traceability is a company's ability to determine the origin or an immediate source of a commodity within its supply chain. The ability to trace commodity volumes back to the point where sources are known and controlled is an essential step for companies understanding the risks associated with cocoa production. We found in our report that almost half of companies stated their intention to trace cocoa volumes to the farm level over other levels of traceability emphasized by the framework. Next slide, please. So the framework identifies 4 central approaches for traceability to allow companies to be confident that they're avoiding deforestation in their supply chains. The first approach is tracing the commodity volume back to the farm level. The second is the use of chain of custody systems, which track product origins. This also includes certification schemes like the Rainforest Alliance. The third is tracing to an intermediate supplier, like a cocoa trader, which have greater visibility to the source of production. And the fourth and final approach is tracing to a jurisdiction or landscape. So essentially an area of production which can demonstrate low social or environmental risk. So as you can see, companies overwhelmingly favored traceability to the farm and using certification. Out of the remaining 7 reported tracing to an intermediate supplier, 3 to a jurisdiction, whereas 11 failed to clearly disclose their traceability intentions. But while we're discussing traceability, it's really important to note that it can be both resource intensive and logistically challenging, which makes it really hard for companies to demonstrate consistent progress at times. So for instance, out of those pursuing traceability to the farm level, only 9 are currently disclosing their progress. Next slide, please. So we found, as my colleague Philip briefly mentioned in the introduction, a potential driver of increased traceability among many cocoa buyers is the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. Through the CFI, 35 major cocoa and chocolate companies, 25 of which were analyzed for this report, are working with NGOs and governments within Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, among other countries, to really help eliminate cocoa-driven deforestation. And as a part of their participation agreements with the CFI, these companies and countries have created action plans, including really robust measures to boost traceability over the course of the next several years. But overall, pursuing traceability remains extremely challenging due to the complexity of cocoa supply chains. Our findings suggest that traceability to the farm level and the use of certification systems is an area of alignment in the framework and a priority for many companies looking to understand their cocoa supply chains. Next slide, please. So let's move on to our findings on monitoring. Strong monitoring is essential for companies to assess both their own adherence to commitments and that of their suppliers. We found that 56% of companies reported monitoring to assess their commitment compliance. Next slide, please. As outlined in the framework, ground-based techniques such as interviews can be particularly effective ways to assess activities at the production level. Audits can also serve as a relatively objective assessment of supply chain operations. In the last decade, technological advances have created a wide range of new monitoring tools as well. For instance, geospatial technologies such as remote sensing and satellite imagery have really empowered companies to detect deforestation near real time. So as you can see here, supplier audits and surveys were found to be the most widespread monitoring techniques. 11 companies also reported using geospatial technologies, while just 6 reported mapping individual farms and 5 used on the ground approaches. Next slide, please. So in instances where these monitoring techniques and mechanisms might identify instances of supplier non-compliance, the framework really calls for clear and consistent procedures. So while we found about a third of companies disclosed addressing supplier non-compliance, many failed to really clearly define their specific procedures for doing so. This indicates that there's room for growth for companies to provide clear reporting for these procedures. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at company monitoring techniques, we found that companies most often use surveys or audits to monitor their operations, while used less frequently, geospatial imaging can be a powerful tool as well. The wide range of mechanisms and lack of transparency regarding non-compliance underlines the use of standardized definitions and methodologies will be increasingly valuable for companies and kind of bringing together the industry in alignment with best practices. Next slide, please. I'd also like to touch on supplier support. Corporate support for suppliers is essential not only for fulfilling their commitments, but ensuring that there's stable commodity supplies and that they can help improve producer livelihoods. As estimated, 90% of the world's cocoa is grown by small-scale producers, commonly referred to as smallholders. Despite their critical role in cocoa production, many companies appear to be overlooking supplier support. For instance, we found that only 36 companies are currently engaged with smallholders on sustainability and human rights. Next slide, please. So to adequately support suppliers in both indirect and direct supply chains, the framework really encourages companies to provide technical, financial, and community-based support. In our report, we found that the majority of companies indicated they provided some form of technical support, most commonly in the form of workshops, training, or distribution of farming materials. Fewer companies reported providing financial support, such as access to savings account and support for certification. Only a handful of companies disclosed providing community development support, like constructing schools, hospitals, things of that nature. One thing I'd like to note is that downstream companies face unique challenges in providing support, in part because of their distance from the initial cocoa production stages and just the complexity of cocoa supply chains. To address this, the framework really encourages support should be channeled through upstream actors, such as traders, or by working in collaboration with certification programs. Next slide, please. So overall, when looking at forms of supplier support, we found that companies most often offer technical support to their suppliers. Providing comprehensive support really remains logistically challenging, particularly for downstream companies, often due to the complexity of cocoa supply chains. So as a result, we found that the companies lack alignment with framework in addressing key areas of support, especially regarding smallholders. Next slide, please. So as I've touched on, consistent disclosures of progress are really essential to understanding companies' performance. In our report, we found that 47% of companies are disclosing progress on their cocoa commitments. This underlines that simply committing to address deforestation is not enough. Implementing clear and consistent reporting will help companies demonstrate their progress and better align with practices set forth in the framework. Next slide, please. So as we conclude, it's been increasingly clear that sustainability in the cocoa industry is growing. Oh, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So again, just to conclude, it's been increasingly clear that sustainability in the cocoa industry is growing, driven by greater industry coordination, corporate awareness, and technological innovation. In our report, we found that there's an increasing corporate alignment with the practices set forth in the accountability framework, but also found components of areas of growth in the scope and coverage of corporate commitments to no deforestation. For more information on our report and the work that we do at Supply Change, please see our website at supplychange.org. And with that, I'll hand it back to Philip. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate that presentation. I think that helps establish kind of a snapshot of where some of the influential companies are in terms of addressing deforestation and human rights issues. I think it was good that you touched on how companies are engaging in traceability and control. And I think it's clear from our research that, there's still room for growth, given that there's kind of like a little bit of a spotty application of the framework, but clearly there's a lot of work that's being done by these companies. And I think for the audience, we now have a speaker, Daryl, who will kind of go over how Nestle is kind of approaching its commitments and how it's implementing its plans. And I think it'll be interesting to kind of see how that company has kind of faced some of these challenges in terms of implementing best practices, and he'll kind of cover some of the areas that we covered in an overview that Kate did. So with that, Daryl, it's yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Philip. So I'll cover how we see this working in our cocoa supply chain. So cocoa is a crop mainly grown in Africa by smallholders. It's associated with several serious issues: poverty and lack of living income, deforestation and child labour. And this last one is typically children working for their parents in the smallholder farm context. So the Nestle Cocoa Plan is our holistic strategy to tackle the main issues. Its vision is a brighter future for cocoa farmers producing great quality cocoa, and it has 3 pillars of action: better farming, better lives, and better cocoa. Better farming is about improving agricultural practices to improve yield and quality. Better lives focuses on the issue of child labour and assisting the kids, the families, and the communities out of this situation. Better Cocoa focuses on transforming the supply chain to create long-term relations with farmer groups and traceability to them. And underlying it all is work with others, public reporting and R&D into cocoa plant science, processing and flavour quality. Next slide, please. So it's essential to work in our supply chain and collaboratively with others. So for the deforestation area, in our supply chain, we're mapping farmers in our supply chain and planting shade trees. In the collaborative space, we're part of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative and kicked off the Cavally project. And the slide doesn't seem to be appearing properly. I'm not sure why that is, so apologies for that. That's better, thank you. And so we're reporting the impact through the Tackling Deforestation report, which we published last year. On the child labour, we have a child labour monitoring and remediation system in our supply chain, while we share our learnings with other groups such as the ILO Child Labour Platform, and we're part of the International Cocoa Initiative. On living income, we have 2 pilot projects, and they'll be evaluated by the research organisation KIT, and we'll be publishing our learnings from that later on. So next slide, please. So looking at more detail of the deforestation work, we'll start with the mapping area. So this is mapping all the, so we reckon there's about 100,000 fields in our supply chain in Ivory Coast and Ghana. And to map all those, we estimate requires walking about 100,000 kilometers. And those are hard kilometers. So in the drone picture there, I walked around that field and it's hard work. You walk up and down steep slopes and through marshes and so on. Now, the benefit of that is you can see on the right, once all these are mapped, then you can compare them with the forests, which you see on the green there, and you can ensure that the fields are outside of the forest areas. And next slide. So agroforestry. Agroforestry is about growing a higher variety of trees on the cocoa farms. So we're mixing in fruit and forest trees, and this has multiple benefits. It improves the above ground biomass, it improves the nutrient circulation in soil, it shades the cocoa trees, which helps them be more resilient to climate change, and it provides additional income to farmers. And you can see there training about the importance of the use of these trees on cocoa farms, a nursery with these shade trees, and a farmer with a recent shade tree planted. There are things you need to look out for. This isn't just a no-brainer. You have to watch out for overshading the cocoa trees and planting species which may actually harbour cocoa diseases or vectors for cocoa disease. In 2020, we planted about 500,000 trees, and we'll be looking to do at least 950,000 this year. On to the next slide. So this is about the wider view, working in the landscape, about forest preservation in the landscape of cocoa, so beyond the cocoa fields in our supply chain. So it's critical that we do our part in preserving the few remaining forests that are still there. And one example here is Cavally Forest. It's a large forest in the west of the Côte d'Ivoire, about 67,000 hectares. It's largely intact, but has suffered some incursion over the last 10 years, and that needs to stop. So we've partnered with the NGO Earthworm and the Ministry of Forests in the Côte d'Ivoire to help preserve and restore this forest. And one of the first actions we're doing is working with the communities that surround the forest to help them understand what the project's about and get their buy-in and their activity to help us do it. So real community-based work. And one of these actions we'll be doing is having the communities patrol the forest together with the Ministry of Forest. Another project we're doing is with Rainforest Alliance, and it's the east of the Côte d'Ivoire. It's for Bosmati and Becky Forest. They're smaller. They have been incurred into more than Cavally Forest. They're definitely still worth preserving. There's plenty of forest there still to preserve. And so we've got a project with Rainforest Alliance to help preserve those. And the next slide. So just a plug for our report, and this is part of the accountability framework to report on your progress, and our Tackling Deforestation report that we released last year. It covers the progress, our KPIs, challenges, and case studies around this work. So thank you, and back to Philip.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Daryl. I think it's really interesting to kind of see how these commitments play out. And cool photo of you, of the place that you were kind of directly visiting in the forest. I think it's one thing to read about these efforts in a report, but to kind of hear some of the kind of the realities that are faced on the ground, and how companies are addressing that provides an interesting backdrop. So with that, I think we'll pivot to the question and answer portion of the webinar. And so I think that we'll start off. We had a question for supply chain about kind of the makeup of what companies were researched and reviewed, and kind of building on that. I think another kind of related question is, how are companies uptaking the accountability framework between upstream and downstream companies, and why? So to start off, I think I'll pass it on to Kate to kind of highlight some examples of key companies and what types of companies we reviewed. So Kate.
Yeah, happy to answer that question. So for our report, we reviewed kind of a wide range of different chocolate manufacturers to candy companies and cocoa exporters. But overall, this report, a majority of the companies were operating downstream. As we touched on earlier, I think there were 70% who were reported as manufacturers or retailers specifically. And like we touched on, downstream companies really do face unique challenges as they purchase a variety of different materials at different stages of the supply chain, and often have limited visibility to the production level in comparison to upstream companies, which often have greater oversight on the ground. But although uptake is largely centered in kind of those downstream companies, really I think the success of the commitments that we've seen, or the extent that they can engage with those upstream actors, for instance, like in cases of supplier engagement, downstream companies can definitely look into opportunities to channel support through traders, or by working in collaboration with certification programs and other themes like we mentioned. But overall, yes, they do face unique challenges.
And one thing I might add too is just to give you a flavor of the types of companies that we looked at, including companies like Barry Callebaut, Olam, other kind of two-tone big traders that are selling to some of the downstream suppliers or buyers, which obviously of, like Nestle, the Nestles and the Mars of the world, as well as other companies that might use cocoa in other products, not just chocolate. Yeah, I think I think that we reviewed 69 companies. So with roughly 40 of them having commitments, there's still challenges in terms of not reporting on their commitments. I think we have a kind of a related question about why might these companies not be disclosing progress. And so I think before I pivot to that question, I just wanted to turn it to Leah and see, given kind of the accountability framework's engagement, what have you been seeing in terms of company uptake and alignment with for cocoa?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, many of the companies we work with are traders or downstream companies who operate across multiple commodities. So, you know, a lot of the value of the framework and a lot of our work is saying how, you know, a consistent approach can be applied across commodities. So how can, you know, no deforestation commitments be applied to cocoa supply chains as well as to palm and soy supply chains? So I think that's a lot of our value when it comes to a lot of the downstream companies that we talk to. And you know, and then for some of the more upstream companies we work with, I think, you know, it's really the value is really in understanding how to align sort of the expectations of their buyers with some of the national or local level policy processes or, you know, other initiatives that they're involved in. So really sort of creating that alignment up and down the supply chain. So, you know, I think we're seeing, you know, increasing uptake kind of up and down the supply chain for different purposes and different uses. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that definitely kind of addresses one of the questions that someone raised in terms of how, you know, a company like Nestle or Mars or these other companies have a lot of commodity commitments. So at Supply Chain, we track a number of commodities for their commitments. And so, you know, cocoa is, you know, another big one that is, you know, being addressed, you know, that companies may be developing new commitments and they can learn from their reporting on other for other commodities. And so one of the things that, you know, Forest Trend Supply Chain Initiative does is we track companies from publicly reported sources such as CDP and, you know, public reports. And there's definitely some crossover in terms of looking at how companies will report on one commodity versus another. And I think the AFI, as Leah was saying, is something that's used to help kind of bridge some of those gaps. Yes, so let me see if I can position another question. And this one's for Daryl. I think one of the things that you had mentioned was that, you know, that you provided examples of how Nestle is kind of working within countries, you know, within Cote d'Ivoire in terms of mapping. And the question is, I guess, is how is Nestle addressing some of these concerns, you know, mapping needs and monitoring needs and frankly, conservation needs across different sourcing regions? Because I think a lot of attention has been given to Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, which are the main, you know, producing countries, but there's a lot of other countries which, you know, might have different contexts.
Yeah, well, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are already 75% of our cocoa supply, so it's a pretty major part of what we're doing, and it is the highest risk area, the highest risk for deforestation and child labour. So I think it's sensible we're starting there. I see that rapidly progressing to Cameroon and Nigeria, for instance, where there's also risk. In LATAM, it may happen later on. Would probably start with GPS points for farmers and do mapping later on. But when you consider how far we've come, I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, you would have thought it was extraordinary that we were going to be mapping all the fields of all of our farmers in these supply chains. But yeah, it's happening. It is difficult. It's just as difficult as we thought it would be, but it is happening. So things move quickly. And, you know, I'm sure it will progress and change in other places.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think I think one thing that was interesting kind of for recent development is Cameroon's recent joining within the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which I think, highlights how that may draw attention and new focus from companies kind of in that geography as well as others. Another question that's come in is, what are some of the main barriers for implementing best practice, and what approaches have companies found to best overcome them? Does someone want to take a crack at that?
I'd be happy to comment on that.
Go for it.
I would start by saying that one of the biggest barriers we saw in our recent research and reporting is just poverty in the cocoa industry. As we touched on, cocoa suppliers, especially smallholders, often have limited resources and more likely to experience non-compliance, which can really expose companies to a number of serious risks like child labor, deforestation, among others. I think with this in mind, companies really demonstrating a robust focus on non-compliance and those levels of support to suppliers can be really valuable. I think also there's that component of collective action among different stakeholders, among private, public entities. Will also be like a really, really crucial component moving forward, and initiatives like the CFI. Ultimately, there's been some delays with that, but the industry, it'll help build greater infrastructure to help support some of those things. And above all, I think it's important to note that there's no really one size fits all solution, as we've seen from the report. There's a wide range of different strategies companies are using and to kind of address these environmental and social issues and try to overcome barriers like that.
Leah or Daryl, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think those words are very wise. It is a very difficult environment to operate in, but where you see the collaboration working, such as in CFI, you really see some progress being made. So, as I said, we've all got responsibility to operate in our supply chains. That only goes so far, and you need to work in a collaborative space as well, but also not use maybe slow progress in that collaborative space to not work in your supply chain. So that the two are important.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important to remember is that I think the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a large group for international manufacturers that produce a lot of forest risk commodities, has kind of positioned this next decade as a kind of pivoting towards collaboration, because I think as Daryl is saying, there's a lot of companies that have made individual progress, but particularly with a commodity like cocoa, where the majority is produced by smallholders, it can be difficult to kind of piece through every individual farmer. So showing progress, demonstrating progress at kind of a regional landscape level is critical. And so those forum and initiatives for collaboration are really key. So I think kind of building on that, one additional question for Daryl do you have any instances or examples you can provide for how Nestle kind of is engaging with smallholders, and especially when there's instances of non-compliance? What does that process look like for kind of addressing that? Because you discussed kind of the monitoring approaches, but what happens when a supplier isn't following some of those guidelines that you provided?
Well, for instance, we've had some decertifications in the last year So that's decertifications of co-ops that before they were up to standard with the Rainforest Alliance, but with increasing scrutiny on traceability, they weren't up to scratch. And so I think the industry has seen quite a few decertifications. So what we're doing is working with those cooperatives to get them up to scratch so they can get recertified. So that's a case of, well, we understand why it happened. We'll work with you for another 6 months until the next audit. You put the graft in, you put the effort in, we'll help you and see if you can get recertified. So that's assisting people through that situation. If it's non-compliance, like they're in a protected area, then it's a lot more difficult. Then typically they'll be excluded from the supply chain. Around child labour, then it's a case of working with the communities, the families and so on to help them out of that situation, because we realise they're not doing it because they're evil. They're not doing it to harm their kids because they love their kids. They're doing it because of the situation they're in and the background they have. And so we understand that it's still unacceptable in our supply chain, but unacceptable in a way that we need to help the people rather than ban them.
Great. No, that's really interesting context. I think following up on that, what types of support can you provide examples of, like, support that you're providing when you're engaging with those suppliers? I think the audience might be interested in that.
Yeah, the kinds of support for the child labour, so support for the children themselves, so getting them birth certificates, because a lot of them don't exist legally, and then they drop out of school at secondary school if that's the case. School kits, so that initial outlay to get them into school and to encourage attendance at school. Helping the families with income generating activities, and then helping the communities, so building schools and helping the quantity and quality of schooling and school infrastructure, canteens at schools, bridge schools, that kind of thing. This all encourages the kids to be going to school rather than working on the fields, as well as awareness raising for the families around what children are allowed to do and what they shouldn't be doing.
Great. Well, I'm aware that we're just hitting the end of our the webinar mark. So thank you all for joining in this this webinar and presentations. Really appreciated the thoughtful feedback and the presentations from you, Leah, Kate, and Daryl. We'll keep an eye out on our upcoming report, which will be released later today. And if you have any questions about the accountability framework or supply chains, you can reach our respective websites. And thank you all.